what I realized at that point was like, oh, next summer I'm going to college and I'm going to be around other people who are interested in the same things that I'm interested in. And also I can pretend to be whoever I want to be, like whoever I've developed into between the ages of 4 and 16. I'm going to be around people who didn't know me when I was 7. And so I can get a clean slate. I can get
Welcome to Overeducated and Underemployed. This week we've got Franz Nicolay. I just want to tell you about a couple of dates I've got coming up. I've got shows in Tallahassee, Athens, Winder. Just come check it out. Come laugh. I'm not going to give you a big intro today. Here's my talk with Professor Franz Nicolay of the Hold Steady right after his chat with Congress over the Live Nation case. Thanks for listening, y'all. Hit subscribe. Welcome to Overeducated and Underemployed. I'm here with Franz Nicolay. He's an author and musician, known for bands like The Hold Steady, books like Band People, and I'm really excited to have him on the show today. I'm going to start, Franz, Mr. Nicolay, just with the same question I ask everybody. What's the first song that you remember loving as a kid?
I think the first song, the first one that comes to mind is Sultans of Swing, off the first Dire Straits record, which my dad had. It was one of the handful of CDs that my dad had. That first Dire Straits record and one of the Laurie Anderson records. I think Strange Angels.
Oh, cool. Cool. Yeah, it really is like the one that comes to mind, because I think what I'm after in that question is not only the first songs that you liked as a kid, but what ones stuck around with you. You know what I mean? So it's not always like the first one that you did listen to, but it's the ones that you remember that I'm interested in learning about.
The first music, I was a classical music snob when I was in elementary school.
Oh.
If you think about the piano pedagogy that most people get in the world, it tends to be classical music based, and then you have to find your way to other kinds of music. That was a little different in that one of my dad's colleagues at the high school he worked at was a jazz trained pianist, and so when I started working with him in middle school, and he taught me some jazz theory, and he was into Randy Newman and stuff like that. So I got that piece of it. But otherwise, if you take piano lessons, mostly you're learning classical music.
And you mentioned being a snob, a classical music snob in elementary school. What did that mean? Tell me more about that.
Well, it meant that I was inculcated in that sort of the mythologies of classical music exceptionalism. I had this set of cassette tapes that was literally called Lives of the Great Composers, and it was they narrate the biography of Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and intersperse clips of the music, and I was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. My dad, was a hippie, was a child of the '60s, and he liked the Beatles and he liked Santana, and he would put on the classic rock station in the truck, and I would be like, it's too loud, and he was like, you're gonna like that someday, and he was right.
Was it like your way of rebelling, maybe, or were you maybe too young for that even?
I think I was too young for that even. I just it was the first music that I connected with, and I liked what I liked.
When did you start to break away from just classical music? And because obviously you are into rock music now, but or at least you make it. I don't know if you necessarily like it, but
I do. How did I get into it? My folks had some records around, not a ton. There was a lot of Beatles. There was Santana. There was like some of the sort of like, I don't know what you call it, the kind of stuff you liked in the 80s if you were artsy. So the Laurie Anderson, Peter Gabriel, that Paul Simon, that kind of world, but not a ton. It was I started getting into it myself mostly, I guess, when I was in middle school. You hit puberty, your friends start getting into rock and roll, and they turn you on to stuff. So it was my 7th grade year was probably 1989, 1990. So it was hair metal, it was Poison, it was Motley Crue, it was Faster Pussycat, and Metallica, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. That stuff, like some of it has aged remarkably well, and then some of it, it's interesting. Like sometimes I feel like we get embarrassed over some of the music we liked as kids, and then sometimes like it ages. You're like, no, that stuff was still good, but
it all shapes you. I mean, the big year in terms of like coming into my own was I was 14 and 15 when 10 and Nevermind came out. So
yeah.
I was exactly in the core demo. There were guys a couple years old. When I was a freshman in high school, the seniors in high school were into the Chili Peppers and Jane's Addiction, right? That was the sort of like alternative explosion that never quite happened in the same way. But I was exactly the right age for that early 90s thing.
So at what point did you start playing music? Was that early on as well? Were you playing classical music as a younger kid, or did you start playing later on?
Yeah, I was playing classical music as a younger kid. I was also really invested in writing my own music really early. So pretty much as soon as I learned what notation was, I started trying to write my own notation. Even as like a 5, 6, 7-year-old, I would take take score paper and write notes on it and then try to play it on my violin or on the piano or whatever. And my parents were not musicians, but they were artists, and they believed in that kind of creativity. So they were really supportive. And I would go for lessons to this husband and wife team when I was in elementary school. And I would do half an hour with the woman who would give me my piano lessons, and then half an hour with the guy who would teach me theory, chord theory, and it was classical theory. So it was counterpoint. It was how to write a fugue. It was how to do voice leading. And then I started getting jazz theory in middle school. But I was always, I would do a piano recital, and then I would always play something that I wrote, which is, they were slightly chaotic pieces, but I was always invested in the idea that I was going to be writing my own music. I started writing.
Go ahead.
Started writing. I picked up guitar as a 9th grader and started writing songs right away. I performed my first song as a freshman in high school.
What attracted you to the guitar in the first place? Was it because you wanted to play rock music?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, you heard Nevermind, and you're like, I want to do that.
Well, one of the things that I realize now in terms of what the ideology of alternative rock was in the late 80s and early 90s was that since it came out of punk and punk was reacting against the 60s, that one of those reactions was against keyboards. And so you would imbibe this idea that keyboards don't belong in rock and roll.
Oh, man. That's so foreign to me because like one of the first CDs I ever got was like Whatever and Ever Amen, Ben Folds 5. Piano has always been part of rock music for me. I'm almost 40, so I missed like, the whole grunge thing. Like I was aware of it, but it wasn't what was cool still by the time I was in middle school. By the time I was in middle school, it had gotten so much lamer. Like it really had. I mean, there was still some good music, but it was the Limp Bizkits and the Korn and the MTV had really like, taken over what my friends were listening to, I think, at that point, too. So
right. You have to remember that when Ben Folds came out, that was treated as a novelty band.
No, I do.
Like,
I do.
It's so weird. This guy's playing piano. Can you believe it?
Yeah, no. I mean, that's fair. Like, I was definitely not like cool in middle school listening to Ben Folds, right? Like, it's not like everybody was like, "Oh my God, that's the coolest shit." But I think it speaks also to something that you've written a lot about and talked about. And so we can get into it a little bit more later. But I think even the difference between like the early and the late 90s is you start to see a lot more vertical integration in the music industry. And so I think it was a lot more of the kind of top 40-esque music that was like predetermined for us by then. Whereas I felt like in the early 90s, bands really had a chance to be artistic and break out and be popular and be both.
For a very brief window, I would say.
Yeah.
You're talking.
Yeah. It was like.
You're talking 92 to 94, maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Where there was a feeding frenzy, and it was like, let's sign up every alternative band in in all these cities and throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And so you get these incredible one-hit wonders and weirdo bands getting a major, King Missile getting a major label deal. But I think that went away pretty quickly.
What were you really listening? Were you listening to much rock music with piano in it at all? Like, were you listening to Ben Folds when that came out? I know that you were probably a little older by then, but
no, I was at the right age for that. No, I don't know. I think I was in high school when the first.
Well, it also depends on which record too.
The first one.
Yeah. See, I don't think I got into them until like the second or third.
I had that record. It wasn't like a core record for me, but I liked it. The big one for me in terms of rock with keyboards in it was the Basement Tapes.
Okay, yeah.
Dylan in general was huge for me, but the Basement Tapes and some of those live records like Before the Flood and Rock of Ages, really in terms of, and especially Garth Hudson. What he was doing was so cool and so interesting and so unpredictable, and I thought they looked cool. Just obviously the iconography of the second band record and the cover of the Basement Tapes. So I really took that on in terms of like this carnival-esque presentation. I bought myself a mandolin. I picked up my dad's accordion. I was like, there's something here.
Yeah.
It didn't really take until later. I moved to New York to go to music school, and I studied jazz piano and composition, but I wasn't planning on being a composer at that point or a jazz pianist. Really, it was just about getting as big a toolkit as I could get to go out into the world and be a working musician. And so I was taking gigs. I was taking gigs as a copyist, or booking wedding bands, or playing guitar in R&B cover bands. It was the idea that I fell into punk rock and playing keyboards was a little bit of an accident in the sense that was the first thing that stuck.
And I think that's true for a lot of artists in general. Like you just do a bunch of, or the ones that make it at least, or find success, is they try a bunch of different things, and it might not be the thing that they're the most passionate about that people respond to, but it's what, if it's what people like and it's a way to make a living doing what you love, you lean into those things.
I think I was just a little bit of a blank slate, though, because you have to remember I was from very rural New Hampshire in the age before the internet. So I was really into music, but I didn't have the kind of encyclopedic knowledge of music that people would have today, right. Because you have the universal jukebox available to you. And so when my freshman year roommate at NYU he was a Jersey ska punk kid, and I was like, hell yeah, this stuff's great. I had never heard it.
Yeah.
I had barely heard Green Day.
Were you going to concerts much as a kid?
Well, no, not really. Again, like I was up in the woods on a mountain. There wasn't much of a live music scene. The live music scene in northern New Hampshire, such as it was jam bands. It was like third tier jam bands. And I wasn't that music didn't excite me that much. I'm told there was hardcore in Manchester, but that was an hour and a half south of where I lived. I never went there.
Yeah.
So, I went to my first club show when I was 16. I did it's very nerdy. I did the summer camp at Berklee School of Music in Boston. It was the first time summer after my junior year of high school. It was the first time I'd ever spent any time away from home. And I snuck into the Axis or Avalon and saw whatever show was playing there, bought a beer, felt pretty cool.
I think those summer camp programs, like especially the music-based ones, are like so important for young musicians. Was there anything that you learned in like doing things like that as a kid that really stuck with you, or that recommend other parents send their kids into for that reason?
What I learned was that there was a whole other world that I was going to have access to pretty shortly. So the place I grew up had 800. The town I grew up in had 800 people.
Oh wow!
And it had an elementary school with double grades because there were so few kids. So first and second grade were together, third and fourth grade together. So what that meant was that my social circle was the same 12 kids from the time I was in preschool till the time I went away to high school. And so the idea that there were other kids who shared my enthusiasms came as a real revelation to me. It's like, oh, there's going to be a world where I can go to and where people hadn't known me since I was a baby.
Yeah.
So what I realized at that point was like, oh, next summer I'm going to college, and I'm going to be around other people who are interested in the same things that I'm interested in. And also I can pretend to be whoever I want to be, like whoever I've developed into between the ages of 4 and 16. I'm going to be around people who didn't know me when I was 7. And so I can get a clean slate. I can get a fresh start.
Yeah. But it sounds like you were very driven from a young age. And I'm curious at what age you decided to be a professional. Like, it sounds like you knew you wanted to be a professional musician. And so you had these, like you said, you wanted really to acquire a tool set, right?
Yeah. When I was like 5 or 6 years old, I wanted to be a paleontologist, of course, because I was into dinosaurs. But pretty soon after that, I was like, no, I'm going to be a musician. I'm going to be a composer. I'm going to write music. I'm going to do this thing. And I was pretty single-minded about that from, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old.
Have you combined those passions and written songs about dinosaurs?
No, that passed.
Let's fast forward a little bit. At what point did you decide you wanted to start writing about music, and were you writing about other things before you were writing about music?
I was a book enthusiast, right? I always read obsessively. I would have a book open at the dinner table. I would have a book on road trips, even if I got car sick. I had a book with me all the time. And I was a pretty good writer as students go. But then most of my 20s, I spent hustling and trying to make a music career and being on the road and making records. And I started taking writing more seriously when I started touring more full time. So that would have been 05, 06, 07, when the Hold Steady especially started being on the road 200 or 300 days a year.
Yeah.
Or when I was trying to split time between the Hold Steady and World Inferno Friendship Society, the other band that I was in. And so I was really on the road a lot.
Did you keep an apartment during those years, or a house?
There was a period where I didn't, and that was a mistake.
Yeah.
Just because the social ask on the road is so high that it was worth it to me ultimately just to have a place where I could come home to and close the door and not speak to anyone for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, especially when being from a smaller town and stuff like that. I imagine just traveling to so many different places like that might be a little bit extra taxing.
Well, that was exciting to me.
Yeah.
That was part of what I was in it for, was to see the world.
And you did, right?
And I did very much. After the first but there are touring circuits, right? So after the first couple times you've been around the country, you're starting to repeat towns and you're starting to repeat clubs. Or in Europe, especially, I was on a very particular anarchist punk circuit where you were going to the same squats all the time. And so the novelty wears off a little bit, and then you're like, well, what else can I do with all of this while I'm here, to the extent that you have any time? Part of it was I would start hitting used bookstores and buying stuff to read in the van. And I got particularly into reading, trying to contextualize the life I was leading. And so some of that was about buying old show business biographies of people, your Jimmy Durantes or John Barrymore or Harpo Marx, people who came up through vaudeville who were traveling entertainers in the same way that I was. And thinking of myself as part of that lineage, not as like a touring rock musician lineage that only starts with Black Flag or with, depending on how far back you take DIY touring, the 1950s R&B bands. But in terms of you're a traveling performer. So that was really helpful. And the other one was just travel narratives in general. And I started keeping fairly detailed, more and more detailed tour diaries. I started writing every day because I was forgetting the stories and the adventures that I was having. And even less about the adventures, but just a sort of narrating, looking out the window and describing the country as it went by. what were the signs that I was seeing? What were the different kinds of vegetation that I was seeing? And my books even today include a lot of travel montages.
Yeah,
I
for sure. I
always,
mean, they are travel books to an extent, especially this book. I feel like is a travel book in a lot of ways too.
But it's a travel book first. It's a travel book before it's a book about music. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, and I think any book is. It depends. The reader is gonna latch on to what they care about more than anything. And I'm not a musician. But I've been obsessed with music my whole life, right? Like,
sure.
But I never was until the last few years. Never really found my creative expression either, or how to at all. Not paint. Never good at painting. Never good at music. I can sing a little bit. Like I sang in choirs and things like that. Did you feel like you knew, like you had this creative expression super early on in life? Do you think that helped you manage life?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that.
And I'm kind of, as I asked it, I'm like, would you even be aware of it if it was always there? Because I'm thinking to myself,
it gave me an organizing principle for my life. If that's what a way of asking it. You come to a crossroads and you try to make a decision, and you have to have certain basic premises that you want to live your life by to help make that decision. And my basic premise was I want to be an artist. I want to be a creative artist. I want to be a musician. I want to be a performing musician. And if you prioritize that clarifies some of the choices.
Yeah, no, that is actually an aspect I wasn't really thinking about, but I do think is important to what I'm talking about here. But the other aspect of that is, a lot of artists, they paint to express their emotions or to process trauma or to feel. Do you think that writing music was a tool for you growing up to express yourself emotionally? Do you think it was something that you maybe as a result ended up with higher emotional intelligence just because you had this expression early on, or maybe it went the other way? I don't know.
I think that it was definitely a cathartic experience, and I gravitated towards music that was cathartic. I did not have a traumatic childhood. I had a happy family. I was pretty content at home. I was not. I had a bad time at school. I was a pretty isolated loner.
The sample size was so small, right?
The sample size was small, yeah. And so I think to the extent that I was unhappy, it was more about that.
Yeah.
And so luckily I came up at a time where the feeling that was being expressed in pop music in the early 90s was that feeling of being a lonely outsider.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the reasons I gravitated to it. And this idea that, you can express yourself in a safe way, but I guess in a way that people will pay attention to if you do this sort of thing.
Right.
So I guess that you can express anger, you can express angst, you can express all the more and more sophisticated feelings as I got older and discovered more music and the ways that more sophisticated songwriters could express that stuff than the music I had been listening to. I think at a certain point I started gravitating towards writing prose because there are limitations. If you're interested in words, there's only so much room for words in songs.
Yeah.
There are guardrails around meter and rhyme and just functionally how many syllables you can fit into a line. Some people push those boundaries. Craig Finn, definitely. Jack Terry Cloth. Some of the people that I worked with could squeeze a lot of words into a short amount of time. But in terms of the descriptive prose that I was increasingly interested in writing, it needed the space of the page to fit it all in.
But when you were writing it first, it was really just to keep track of everything you were doing. Did you?
Yes.
Did it occur to you how somewhat surreal? Some of the experiences in this book are pretty surreal. Were you aware of that at the time, or did it kind of take that reflection to be like, oh no, this is actually something that other people would want to read? Did you realize it while you were writing it?
I was looking for it while I was on those tours. So I had started publishing. In my early years of touring, especially with World Inferno, crazy shit was happening to us regularly. But since that was the first band I had ever toured with, really, I didn't realize how unusual that band was. And so I was,
Right.
and you don't realize, because you're young, you don't realize how much you're going to forget. You just assume you'll always remember everything exactly how it happened. Also, we were drinking a lot. And so things disappear.
That can play a role.
That can play a role. But people wanted to hear those stories. And then I realized I couldn't narrate them properly, or I was writing these stories, I was getting some stuff published, and then at a certain point, it felt like that they were getting longer and longer. At a certain point, it seemed like the next logical step was a book-length project, and I knew that I was going to be doing these overseas tours, particularly the Trans-Siberian tour, and so I wrote that up as a book proposal and went into that. Those couple years of touring, consciously thinking, like, I'm going to be taking detailed notes here with the idea that I'm going to turn this into a book.
What do you think those tours taught you about touring in America that you had that hadn't occurred to you before?
I think that there was a much, especially in Eastern Europe, and especially at that time in Russia and Ukraine, there was a much more active political sensibility among the punks. I was touring punk scenes, right? Yeah. And the punks in the United States were pretty apolitical, I would say, because you're talking about the early 2000s, the Obama years.
Not a lot to rebel against if you're, there is, but we had won or whatever, right?
Like, things were pretty good.
Yeah.
You could, there were things to talk about, veganism or whatever it was, but it wasn't we have a repressive authoritarian government and we have Nazi skinheads trying to break up our shows, or we're trying to reclaim, in the case of Ukraine, we have to be out. We want to overthrow the Russian puppet president and make ourselves what they would call a normal European country. So people had legitimate political engagement.
Yeah. Things were just very, like, the politics themselves were different too, and that's why you're saying.
Well, I think the politics were more visceral, right? So
yeah,
the politics, I think, your American punks were talking the same politics about anti-fascism and veganism and all this sort of the hand-me-down from Crass and that sort of strain of anarcho-punk, but it wasn't necessarily something that you were forced to apply on a daily basis, or other than to declass yourself and set yourself apart from the middle-class families that you came from.
Do you think you came back with like a new awareness, like a new class consciousness when you came back from those tours?
I don't think I came back with a new class consciousness. I think it's more interesting to look back on those tours now, because as an American in the Obama era, it was very easy to be genially condescending.
Sure. Yeah.
About countries whose politics seemed more regressive or seemed more developing, or it was very easy for me to be judgmental of the Russian punks, for example, and be like, why are you so inward looking? And why are you so defeated? And what's the word I'm looking for? Just, it was easy for me to parachute in and be like, you guys live in an authoritarian dictatorship, and why aren't you doing more? And then that came to America, and what are we doing? It's how different is it? Like, you keep your head down and you try to get through life.
Yeah, I think the complacency that kind of arose in the Obama years that you're talking about that Americans had is part of what directly led to where we are now. Like, this idea that, okay, everything's good, we can disengage from this stuff and just live our lives. I think the wake up call for us was like freedom of speech is something you constantly have to fight for. You can't these antitrust laws, like we have to keep them. You can't just like trust that things are gonna go okay if you don't keep an eye on it. You know what I mean? I feel like we've learned now.
Yeah.
We really, even when things are good, we got to make sure they keep going good.
Well, and you have an individual responsibility to be a part of that constant maintenance of weeding the garden.
So you played with the Hold Steady for like almost.
Yeah, I did my first. I played with them first in 2004, and now it's 2026. So 22 years with a 6-year break in the middle.
Let's talk about some of the other projects that people don't know as much about. You've played a lot of Eastern European music as well. Can you just tell me about some of your other musical projects over the years?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was in Inferno Friendship Society, the longest continuous lineup of that sort of now legendary anarchist punk circus collective.
Yeah.
That was my most formative years as a touring musician. I had a group called Guignol with Peter from World Inferno. It was clarinet, accordion, tuba, and drums. We were doing sort of our version of Balkan-style jazz, including a couple collaborations with Mischief Brew, Eric Peterson, folk punk singer.
Yeah.
One of my favorite songwriters. What else? Antisocial Music. I founded and was president of this composer-performer collective that was playing new chamber music that we were putting on in indie spaces and DIY spaces. I have done a bunch of solo records and solo touring.
That's the other stuff that I'm most familiar with, I would say, than your Hold Steady music. It seems like I want to pause for a second on your solo. It feels very almost operatic in some senses sometimes. But one thing I haven't heard you talk about is, do you have a love of musicals or stage theater, or is that something that just kind of like inserted itself into?
I think people think that because of the way I sing.
I see.
And I have come to a real appreciation of musical theater, but only later in life. So, a few years ago, I went through a big Sondheim phase, but it was a period of discovery where I had not really paid a lot of attention to this music before. And so to fall in love with it as a guy in my 40s was a really interesting experience, because you don't usually have if you're a middle-aged person who's deeply invested in music, it's very rare that you get to really discover a truly canonic figure. And for the first time as an adult, it's like, have you heard about this guy Beethoven? Turns out he's amazing. And so Sondheim for me was like, I have a whole career's worth of unbelievable music to dive into, and I went really deep for about 2 years. But no, what I'm interested in is the theatrical and the dramatic.
Yeah.
And some of that came from my the way I sing is basically because I was into Pearl Jam when I was a kid, and then that led me to American Music Club and Mark Eitzel, and that led me to Neil Hannon and the Divine Comedy, and these singers who are really full-throated tenors and baritones.
Yeah.
When I came up, there was a prejudice against being openly dramatic and being openly self-conscious of yourself as a performer that came from punk and indie rock reacting against what they perceived as a lack of authenticity. And I always hated that. I always hated this sort of like, I've just, I've stumbled onto stage in my work clothes, and what are you guys doing here? Don't pay attention to me. I'm just some guy. It's like, no, you're on stage. There's a reason everyone's there to see you. But treat it like an occasion. Take it seriously. Give the people the respect they deserve of being aware that you're a performer. You're, as the line from the movie goes, you do have an act, and your act is not having an act.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you just articulated what kept me from ever fully buying into the whole grunge thing without me ever like really realizing it. I'm gonna be real. Like, I think you just put your finger on exactly why I missed the boat, for one.
I'm talking less about grunge, I would say, because I feel like that was emotive and that was melodramatic. But I'm talking more about like the slacker stuff, the Pavement, the Elliott Smith, like that business.
And I all lumped that all together in a lot of ways growing up. And it's interesting you say that because it was like by the time I'm in my 20s, I loved Elliott Smith. But
I'm not saying the music's great.
No,
I'm just talking about the stage personas.
I just think it's interesting that, I don't think there's any disagreement between, but I think like what's interesting is like it took me a while to get into it. Like I was aware of Elliott Smith and kind of dismissive of it because of what you're talking about, I think. And then underneath there's great songs and there's great music, but I think that I don't give a shit attitude because I loved Showman when I was a kid. Growing up, I saw Into the Woods, like my chorus teacher showed that to me in middle school. So like, I loved musical theater. I loved all that sort of thing. I wanted authenticity in my music, right? But the theatrics wanted, and I think that's what drew me to the Hold Steady and the Drive-By Truckers when I was in 18, 19 years old, is you had both. You had like all these things that we've talked about. Like you had very like, lyrical music, even though sometimes you got to go beyond the song to get the words out. I think like the Drive-By Truckers do an amazing job of putting these big ideas into 3 minutes, and so does Craig Finn, and then the other idea of like it being somewhat of a show too. I think like that it played a role in these bands, and I think it was by the mid 2000s. You had bands wearing suits again. You had a reaction to what you're talking about, where this I think about like the Hives or the Strokes and like these bands. Well, the Strokes less so, but because they had kind of that I don't give a shit attitude, but it was
they
all
were
very
wearing
orchestrated,
costumes.
and that
it was a different costume.
So
they were in costume as in their leather.
Yeah.
There's a book by a guy called Jonas Barish that I reference a lot called The Anti-Theatrical Prejudice. And he makes the point that in the English language, the adjectives that we have that are drawn from various art forms are compliments. You say something's artistic, you say something's painterly, you say something's poetic, you say something's literary. These are all compliments. But the adjectives that are drawn from theater are pejorative. So you say something's melodramatic, you say something's theatrical, you say something is someone's putting on a show. Like they're all pejorative. And he traces this long history throughout Western civilization of a suspicion of the theater, of an idea that there's something fake about the theater, there's something false about the theater, there's something that can't quite be trusted about the theater. And that's something that we've really imbibed, specifically in American music culture, this idea that there's a kind of, that authenticity is tied to untutored folkness, right? Untrained voices, untrained musicianship, a suspicion of overly complicated chords or song structures in a way that has really trickled down, and in a way that doesn't necessarily exist in the same way in, for example, in Europe, which is, I think, why my solo stuff has gone over historically better in England and Germany, because they have this, because the rock and roll in the United States imbibed a lot of its ideology from the folk revival and from blues and from this idea of white college kids in the 1950s looking to the Harry Smith anthology, to Woody Guthrie, to these 4-chord storytelling, to Skip James and so on, as like, this is the real American music. And as a result, turned their back on the Tin Pan Alley tradition and the vaudeville tradition that had dominated American popular music in the first half of the 20th century. And because that happened in the United States, and because of the counterculture in the 60s, that ideology took a much stronger hold than it did in, for example, England, where they had the music hall tradition, in France, where they have the chanson tradition, in Germany, where they have this Weimar cabaret tradition. And they got rock and roll, but they got it as an import. It wasn't something that the culture, like the culture in the United States, actively rejected that more trained, professionalized performance tradition.
Yeah.
And so, for example, in England, you still got that music hall tradition in their rock and roll. So you hear that in Paul McCartney, for example. You hear that in Ray Davis.
Yeah.
That stuff is very in Scott Walker. That stuff is very much still there. In France, you still got the chanson tradition in Jacques Brel and Serge Gainsbourg in the mixed with rock and roll.
Yeah, even like bands like Queen.
Queen, for sure. Yep.
So yeah, it's really interesting the way the fact that we're always skeptical of the theater. But do you think that's one of the tricks of rock and roll is like you don't really let on that it's a show? It is a show, and like behind the scenes, it's very orchestrated and all that. But the moment the audience thinks it's a show, you have these negative adjectives, these pejorative adjectives.
Because people are really attached to this idea, this sort of meaningless term, authenticity.
Yeah, and I think even as we've entertainers have started to put more and more of their lives out there, right? Like now people are streaming 24/7, or you have 24-hour access to some of your celebrities and things like that. But I think the result of that, what's more interesting now is like, now instead of like what they choose to show us, it's like what do they choose not to show us? That becomes the more.
Yeah, it's a pendulum that's going to swing back and forth between the desire for mystery and the desire for transparency.
So over the years, what do you think are the biggest struggles for touring entertainers? Aside from like the big ones, I guess more specific. Obviously, money, public access, and public. But what are some of the things that you think are like maybe some of the hidden traps of being a touring artist in this world?
Well, money is the big one, and the little one, right?
Yeah.
Money's the big one, but how do you pay for the tour that is what drives all the other problems, right? Like if you can't pay for a motel room, then you're sleeping on someone's couch or on someone's floor, and then you didn't get a good night's sleep, and then you get sick, and then you don't have health insurance, or to help yourself sleep through the night, you drink a bunch, and then before you know it, you're an alcoholic. Money is the root of all the problems.
I almost feel like touring entertainers, and this just kind of occurred to me, we're like the canaries in the coal mine. Like all of the shit that goes wrong with America went wrong with the musician. It hits them first, right? Like they see it all first. They see whether you're a musician or a comedian or in touring theater, whatever. Like life on the road, you see the prices increase. That affects you faster than it affects other people. Then when it starts to affect other people, you see the crowd sizes go down. I just think about all the things you talked about, even down to dealing with your problems with substances. I think it's like you look at the musicians, whatever's affecting them, that's us in like 3 years or maybe even a year or maybe even a month under this regime. I don't know, but it's
in a very concrete way. Gas, right? Gas prices affect travel costs affect the ability of musicians to tour. Affects ticket prices, which have come see the tour.
Do you think that's less so in
tariffs
Europe?
And postage rates, which have
with the public transit?
Well, it depends how you want to tour.
Yeah,
you can tour on public transit in parts of Europe, but that if there's a backline, right? How much gear can you bring on a train?
Sure.
If you want to bring your own gear, if you want to have a drum kit, if you have a bunch of merch to carry, then you can't travel on trains.
Yeah.
I've done it both ways, but then but the distances are shorter. Also, the drives are shorter.
So that's I imagine also if you're based in Europe,
but also the gas. Like for example, I go tour in the UK. Your drives are 2 or 3 hours instead of 5 or 6 hours.
Yeah.
So but at the same time, then the gas is more expensive. So 6 of 1. But just in terms of like the physical and mental toll it takes, obviously, if the drives are not as long, that makes it a little easier. Tariffs and postage affects musicians because of merch prices, overseas shipping. Anyone who orders records in the mail has discovered how much media mail postage has gone up.
Yeah.
The analogy that I made in the book, Band People, was about just the easy pun on the gig economy.
Right.
Like the idea of that being a freelancer is necessarily preferable than being on a W-2. Musicians would have a lot to say about that.
I think that points more to the failures of our society than anything else. I think if the gig economy is more appealing than like being in the system, then the system, whatever, the 9 to 5, the traditional work system has failed us. But
if you look at the history of rock and roll, at its peak years, 60s, 70s, 80s, you're talking about artists who are coming up through the lightly socialized economies of the post-war era. So there's a lot of government support for unemployment. The British musicians of the 60s and 70s, you read, they're on the dole, right? They're on unemployment, and that's how they can make their bands happen. In Sweden, starting with ABBA, but all the great pop acts coming up through Max Martin, there's incredible support historically in that time in Sweden for young popular musicians. I have a friend who was a rock star over there who's about my age, and he said you could go down to if you were a teenager and you put a band together, you would go down to the town hall and register with the town hall as a band, and you would get a stipend and a free rehearsal space and access to instruments. It was just seen as that popular music was a core part of the Swedish export identity. The welfare state in Germany, similar thing. The place, America never had that in quite the same way. But you look at the places where there were really fertile music scenes, and it always goes hand in hand with a lot of cheap and easily available housing.
Yeah, I mean,
sometimes that's in various neighborhoods in New York, like the loft scene in Soho in the 1970s, or in the East Village, or in Williamsburg. Each of these then, 20 years later, becomes unaffordable. But for some period of time, there's a place where young artists can live cheaply. College towns, right? Historically,
we've talked about Athens on this podcast a lot, and how it became like a breeding ground for music. And one of the main reasons was like the cost of living. It was so cheap to be able to get an apartment, and then the cost of living, and then having like a community that fosters that creativity and those goes and see shows, right?
Well, the ability to live on a part-time job.
Yeah.
But to have a sort of shitty job so you have the time and the energy to make your art as a young person. I think the counterexample is a place like Boston. For the number of colleges and the amount of students that are in Boston, it's, aside for a couple of years in the 80s, it has always punched a little below its weight in terms of producing musical acts. I think, in part because it's never been a particularly cheap place to live, and people don't tend to stay there.
I think it's been a breeding ground for comics, though. There's a lot of comics that come out of Boston. But
I don't have a unified theory of why that would be.
Yeah, well, I don't either. I don't know either, but I do think like the experiences and the things that they struggle with, like the things that hit musicians, hit comedians. It very much in the traveling entertainment business. But then I think the other aspect of it is like I do think like comedians and musicians are cut from the same cloth. I don't know if it's a joke or just a little quip that like all comedians are failed rock stars, and most comedians wish they were, or most musicians wish they were comedians. That's not always true, but like I think
the grass is always greener. There's always people have their another genre of performance that seems like it would be easier. I think for what the appealing thing about comedians for musicians is it's performing, but you don't have to deal with all the other people, and you don't have to deal with all the gear.
Yeah, I love not having to deal with the gear, but
I think that's a big thing.
Yeah, no, I think I was thinking about this the other day. Like, I think in the ways that there's advantages and disadvantages like that, I think there's give and take for both, because like I think touring musicians now, they might not get paid fairly, but they do get paid, I think, more frequently than touring comedians when at the same level, playing the same rooms even.
I can't speak to what comedians make.
Yeah, no, I think like use advantages like no gear, not having but then there's I think I don't know that it's necessarily harder for one or the other. I think it kind of evens out in the long run is kind of what I'm getting at. But I want to fast forward to recently you were part of the House committee hearings about the Live Nation antitrust lawsuit that was before the House. And first of all, I'm going to play it right here.
Good afternoon. My name's Franz Nicolay. I've been a professional touring and recording musician for almost 30 years. I've played on almost 200 records and over 2,000 concerts all over the world, as far as Siberia, Mongolia, and China. I've played Carnegie Hall, and I've played no-name punk houses. I'm a rock and roll lifer with a sideline in writing and teaching. I give my credentials in brief because I don't expect anyone in this room to know my name. The music industry obviously is always going to focus on the Taylor Swifts and Bruce Springsteens, but the monopolistic forces that control the industry equally affect the broad popular music middle class, the non-famous music workers who've been the focus of my writing and my lived experience. When we talk about the U.S. economy, the headlines focus on the biggest firms, but we all understand that the effects are felt by the millions of semi-anonymous individual entrepreneurs and small businesses. The same is true in the music economy. Our business today lives and dies on ticket sales and on the merchandise we sell at those concerts. For example, my income from the music over the last 5 years averages about 10% from record royalties and 90% from live performance and the merchandise we sell at those shows. We are no longer really in the recording business, we're in the performance business. But this also means we're in the repeat customer and customer service business. Being in a rock band in the 21st century is not the Dionysian bacchanalia conjured up by the term rock star. Those of us lucky enough to do this are middle-class proprietors of small businesses, which we've built over many years, and which depend, like any small business, on maintaining a healthy relationship with loyal customers, or as we call them, fans. This means we're not in the business of squeezing every penny out of them at every opportunity and maximizing our profit in every transaction. What the middle-class musician wants is not a fan who spends $2,000 for a stadium concert once, but one who can afford a ticket with enough left over to buy a t-shirt, a poster, a couple drinks, which benefits our friends at the independent venues, and has the kind of good time that makes them want to come back next year when we return. They want to feel like we're in this together, band and audience, from a place of mutual respect, not that their love for what we do is being exploited. We're like the local general store in a small town. We may be the only place that offers the things our friends and neighbors need, but that doesn't mean we want to take advantage of them. We want them as friendly, loyal, repeat customers who feel themselves to be members of the community we establish through our music. But we're also, to fans, the face of ticket sales. So if concert tickets sell out in seconds and instantly appear on secondary markets for 5 times the price, or if mysterious fees add 20 or 30% at checkout, they can't complain to Ticketmaster, they come to our Facebook page. So business practices we can't control hurt our crucial relationship with our fan community. In a healthy competitive market with multiple independent venues, promotion, and ticketing options, predatory fee schemes could be avoided without the burden falling on the relationship between artists and our audiences. But live music hasn't been a healthy competitive market. Instead, a vertically integrated corporation that controls venues and tour promotion and ticketing and artist management to the almost total control of many music markets is, to a comical degree, the epitome of the kind of monopolistic power that antitrust law was created to address. We as artists simply don't have the range of city-to-city, venue-to-venue choices that would constitute a healthy ecosystem, as non-Live Nation venues are consolidated or forced out of business or feel pressured to adopt extractive Live Nation policies to stay afloat. And we're in solidarity with independent venues and promoters because they gave us gigs when we didn't have any fans and helped us build what we've been able to build. So we ask that ticket resale and speculation be capped at or near face value so that our fans are not being exploited at no benefit to us, the artists. We ask for full transparency about fees, going further than the floor set by the FTC rule, so fans are aware who's responsible for higher ticket prices. We hope that the remedies phase of the lawsuit results in the breakup, which doesn't just separate Ticketmaster from Live Nation, but also separates the venue and artist management businesses from their tour promotion businesses. We simply want to be able to retain and manage the relationship between musician and audience without the influence of extractive corporate power. We try to do business in a sustainable way that embodies respect for fans rather than squeezing every last dollar from them. And we want the opportunity to partner with companies who share those values. Thank you for your time.
So then, you know what you said, I know what you said, but now all the listeners now also know what you said. And
Okay.
so that way you can refer to things that you said in that testimony. First of all, like, how did you get approached to do that in the first place?
I have a longstanding relationship with an advocacy group called the Future of Music Coalition that I've worked, a really good friend of mine used to work for. And so I've occasionally been involved in various policy things that they're involved in. And so they were part of the team that was putting together this hearing. They were looking for, they had the guy from Department of Justice, they had the California Attorney General, and they had they wanted one representative from each of the affected parties in the music community. So a venue owner, an independent promoter, and a musician. I think they were looking for someone with a bigger name. I know that Sheryl Crow and Jack Antonoff had given them polite no's.
Interesting.
Future Music asked me because of our relationship. I think, obviously, the Congress people want a big, flashy name because they're fans. They would love to get Springsteen. They want it to be on MSNBC instead of C-SPAN 3. But I think there's a way in which someone like me can make a better argument.
I agree.
Because the pop music aristocracy, the really high end, they can dictate terms to Live Nation. And it's the mid-level and lower level performers and promoters who are really at the mercy of Live Nation. So I can speak a little bit more to that.
One thing that struck me about your testimony was you pointed out that they want to take over all these different aspects of the industry. And then I think about the life, and you pointed this out too, the life of a touring musician, like they're expected to do every aspect of it. It's like they have chipped away at the tools for artists to do these things independently, and to where now they really do have to do them themselves if they want to operate outside of Live Nation. And now Live Nation is making that like even more impossible.
I have two things to say to that. One is that artists are in a really precarious or ambivalent space vis-a-vis Live Nation, because Live Nation's pitch to artists is that they can make us more money, and so it puts us in it positions artists as antagonistic to the independent promoters and venue owners who would otherwise be our allies. It's a divide and conquer kind of strategy. Because the independent venues and independent promoters are the ones who give us gigs when we're coming up.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You're like, Live Nation's only interested once you're already popular.
Yeah.
And so you're torn between the loyalty to the people who you work your way up with, and then this corporate entity that's flashing around bigger checks than those people can cut. And so the utility of something like this is that it forces us to articulate our ideals in terms of, when push comes to shove, do you want to make the most money possible, or do you want to have a long-term relationship with venues and promoters and fans?
And you want those venues and promoters to still be doing
in business.
Yeah.
If you want to have a long career, right? You want the same. There are promoters that I met in 2003 that I still see on the road in 2026, and that's how you want it to be. You want to have these years and decades long relationships. And the other piece of it in terms of entrepreneurship is that if you look at the and I'm borrowing this argument from Liz Pelly's Spotify book, Mood Machine, which I recommend to anyone.
Yeah,
if you look at the propaganda that the tech music companies targets musicians, they don't emphasize the collective. They emphasize the individual. The idea in Spotify advertising to musicians, Spotify for artists, the kind of artist that they spotlight as really being able to make the best use of the tools that Spotify offers is the independent entrepreneur. It's not a band. It's one person in their bedroom with a laptop who's making a lot of music really quickly, really attentive and responsive to the audience feedback and the algorithmic feedback that you can get, and hyper-capitalist in that sense, in the sense that you are this independent entrepreneur who's constantly trying to grow your own brand.
It feels like our whole society is like doing this thing. They call it, like, you've probably heard of a couple of things like looks maxing or things like that, but I call it min-maxing our society. Like, we're trying to do the most with the least, or get by with the least and get the most out of it. And like, that's just not a way. I think it's first of all, I think it's just the logical end game of capitalism. But then also, it's where we are now. And as it's happening, it's causing the enshittification of everything.
Well, it's one of these long-term pendulum shifts, and a kind of irony, right? Is so that there was the corporate culture of the 1950s, 60s, the post-war era, the Mad Men era, right? That my parents' generation rejected as conformist. Right? That you put on a gray suit, you go to work, you work 40 hours a week, and you retire at 65 with a watch and a pension. Like, who would want that?
Which people
right?
fought really hard to get to that place, right? Like labor unions, and to even have a 40-hour work week was something we fought really hard to get in not that long before then.
The point being that the counterculture from the 60s through the 90s was, how can we break free of this stultifying conformity? And now it's, congratulations, everybody's broken free of this stultifying conformity. Everybody's a free agent. You have no security. You have no pension. You have none of that. You don't have any of the protection that a big corporate job that you keep for 40 years would have given you. So congratulations. You won.
Yeah. And I think the other part of that is, like, it has become way less appealing, and that idea has also disappeared for the average worker too. Like, most people that are in that game, and we saw this during COVID,
well, that's
people
the
are
irony
working
of it.
3 or 4 jobs just to get by. But progress in America has always come kicking and screaming. So maybe.
Well, I think the myth is that Whig theory of history that things are always progressive. Right? Things are changing.
Yes.
But then it has, and in a way that people who think of themselves as progressive might want, but these have unpredictable consequences.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, now we're in a situation where everyone can work for themselves and be a freelancer and fulfill their creativity in however that might turn out. But you no longer have union protection, you no longer have health insurance, and you no longer have all these other things that you might have wanted or taken for granted. Yeah.
It's really fast. I feel like I could talk to you for like 4 more hours, Franz. This has been really great. Is there anything you want to mention that you've got project-wise coming up? Anything you want to plug before we wrap this up?
There's going to be a couple new records. I'm going to record a new record. There's going to be a new record by Just the Best Party, which is that classic lineup of World Inferno. We wrote a new record and recorded it.
You've got the annual shows,
annual shows around Halloween, Hold Steady shows. Yeah, just
and you got
working.
Something in June with them too, right? There's a
big show in Chicago at the Salt Shed.
Yeah.
So
I plan to. This will probably be coming out like right before then, I think. So
okay, yeah, the weekend of June 13th. There's 3 shows in Chicago.
Franz, Professor Nicolay, I feel like there's a lot of things we could have talked about that we didn't get into, and maybe we'll get a chance to do it again sometime. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I hope all you Hold Steady fans on your way to Chicago have a great time, and hope you enjoyed my talk with Franz Nicolay. Hit subscribe. Next week, we got Sean Lubin. And week after that, we got Lige Curry from Parliament Funkadelic. And I'm recording a bunch of stuff in the next couple of weeks, too. You're going to be real excited about it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, y'all.